Hi there. Welcome back to another slow, sleepy journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we'll be drifting gently through cobbled alleys of medieval Europe, where ancient cathedrals whisper secrets and old candles flicker beside even older scandals. Our focus tonight? Some of the strangest stories ever recorded in the Catholic Church. Not the inspiring ones, not the spiritual ones, but the odd, uncomfortable, and absurd ones. We'll begin with a story so bizarre, so utterly surreal, that it sounds like satire, but it was very, very real. A pope who dug up a corpse, dressed it in papal robes, placed it on a throne, and put it on trial. No, you're not dreaming. This actually happened. So, if you're ready, tuck yourself in, close your eyes, and let's drift back to the year 897. It was a warm, uncertain year in Rome. The streets were dusty and tense. Power changed hands like dice tossed in a tavern, and behind the gilded walls of St. Peter's, a drama unlike any other was about to unfold. 9 months after his death, Pope Formosus, a once powerful and controversial figure, was dug up from his grave. Yes, dug up. His decaying body, still vaguely intact, was dragged from the tomb he had been resting in, and dressed once more in the white robes of papal dignity. But there would be no prayers that day, no incense, no hymns, no peace. Instead, his lifeless corpse was propped up on a throne to stand trial. The trial would come to be known as the Cadaver Synod, an event so surreal, so darkly theatrical, that even medieval chroniclers wrote about it with hesitation. The accuser? Pope Stephen VI, the man who succeeded Formosus, and also deeply hated him. The charge? Usurping the papacy and performing episcopal duties while allegedly unqualified. It didn't matter that Formosus had been dead for nearly a year. Stephen wanted vengeance, and vengeance apparently required an audience. In front of a crowd of bishops and clergy, the corpse was interrogated. Since Formosus couldn't speak, being dead and all, a deacon was appointed to answer for him, speaking on behalf of the rotting pope like a grim ventriloquist's doll. It was grotesque, and yet entirely real. Stephen VI screamed, ranted, pointing fingers at the corpse as though it could blink or protest. The trial was, unsurprisingly, one-sided. Formosus was found guilty. The punishment? His body was stripped of its holy robes. The 3 fingers used for blessings were cut off, and the remains were thrown into the Tiber River like garbage. But history, as always, refused to stay still. The public was horrified. Riots broke out. Just a few months later, Pope Stephen VI was imprisoned and strangled to death in his cell. The body of Formosus was later recovered from the river and reburied, this time for good. But the damage was done. A pope had put a corpse on trial, and centuries later, we're still whispering about it. If you thought putting a corpse on trial was the strangest moment in papal history, well, let's keep going. Because now we arrive in the late 15th century, during the height of the Renaissance, a time of art, war, and backroom deals wrapped in velvet. And at the centre of it all stood a pope. But not just any pope. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, though you may know him better by his papal title, Pope Alexander VI, a name that still sends quiet shudders through the Vatican's marble halls, because his papacy wasn't known for holiness, humility, or reform. It was known for family. Rodrigo Borgia was a skilled politician, a brilliant manipulator, and a man who knew how to survive. He came from a powerful Spanish family and climbed the ranks of the church with ruthless precision. But here's where things get tangled. As a cardinal, Rodrigo had taken a vow of celibacy. But vows, it seemed, were more of a suggestion than a rule in his case, because he had a mistress, a long-term mistress. Her name was Vanozza de Catanei. Together they had children, several, but the most famous, perhaps infamous, was Cesare Borgia. Ah, yes, Cesare. A man who started as a cardinal and ended as a warlord. Because nothing says divine calling like sword fights and political assassinations. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the Vatican in the 1490s. Under Pope Alexander VI, it wasn't just a centre of worship, it was more like a royal court. Banquets, mistresses, family alliances, secret negotiations. The Borgias treated the church as a family business, and business was booming. Alexander wasn't just Pope, he was father, matchmaker, strategist, and protector of Borgia interests. He arranged marriages for his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, not once, not twice, but 3 times, each time to strengthen his family's power. Each husband mysteriously died or disappeared when they were no longer politically useful. Some whispered Lucrezia was behind the poison, others blamed Cesare, and some simply shrugged and said, typical Borgia. Let's go back to Cesare for a moment. Originally groomed for the church, he was made a cardinal at just 18 years old. But robes and prayer books weren't really his style. So, with his father's blessing, Cesare resigned from the cardinalate. Yes, that's possible apparently. And became a military leader. He waged wars across Italy, conquering towns and eliminating enemies, all while expanding the Borgia territory. And his father, the Pope, cheered him on. The Pope, cheering on his son, who used to be a cardinal, now a warlord. It's all very holy. Critics of Alexander VI accused him of simony, selling church offices for money. They accused him of nepotism, promoting family members to positions of power. And they accused him of, well, just about everything. But for all the scandals, he remained in power for 11 years, longer than many expected, because say what you will about Alexander, he was clever, and like all great players of power, he knew how to outlast his enemies. Until, of course, death came calling. He died in 1503, possibly from malaria, possibly from something more sinister. Some historians believe he and Cesare accidentally drank poisoned wine meant for someone else. A bit ironic. Poison, after all, was rumoured to be their favourite method of problem solving. Cesare survived but weakened. He never regained his power, and the Borgia legacy began to crumble. Today, the name Borgia still lingers like incense in a dusty chapel. Famous, infamous, unforgettable. A pope who was a father, a cardinal who became a soldier, a daughter surrounded by mystery, and a family tree more complicated than most royal houses. And the church? It moved on, of course. New popes came. Old sins were buried, or at least covered, but not forgotten, because history has a way of keeping receipts, especially the juicy ones. And if you think this was scandalous, well, wait until you meet the Pope, who installed his teenage relatives as cardinals, and the one who hosted wild parties inside the Vatican. Of course, when speaking of Renaissance scandals, we can't avoid one of the most infamous legends whispered in the shadows of the Vatican. The Banquet of Chestnuts, held allegedly in the Papal Palace. The year was 1501. Rome was opulent, chaotic, and cloaked in incense and intrigue. And the man sitting on St. Peter's throne, Pope Alexander VI, still very much alive, and still very much a Borgia. Though by now he had grown older, wearier. Much of the day-to-day scheming had been passed on to his ever-ambitious son, Cesare Borgia, who was rapidly becoming more feared than admired. The church was in theory a holy institution. In practice, it had become something else entirely. The banquet of chestnuts is not widely discussed in official Vatican history. Naturally. But a few records survive, scattered, incomplete, and dripping with scandal. It is said that one autumn evening, in the grand halls of the Apostolic Palace, a banquet was held. But this was not a feast of prayer or contemplation. According to chroniclers, especially Johannes Burchard, a papal master of ceremonies, who probably saw more than he wished. The evening included 50 dancers, all courtesans, invited into the palace by Cesare Borgia himself. The women were instructed to strip slowly and perform for the guests, noblemen, cardinals, and clerics alike. Dozens of candles flickered against ancient marble. Tables were pushed aside. And then came the chestnuts. The name of the banquet comes from the moment when chestnuts were scattered across the floor, and the dancers were instructed to crawl on all fours, collecting them, while the guests watched, clapped, and wagered on who would collect the most. Yes, this reportedly happened inside the Vatican. The night only escalated from there. Burchard claimed that prizes were given out to the men who could, shall we say, perform the most frequently with the dancers. Jewels, fine clothes, even blessed relics were awarded in what was essentially a debauched tournament. And through it all, it is said, Pope Alexander VI watched from his seat. Some claim he participated, others argue he merely tolerated it, but either way the scandal remained. Now there are historians who doubt the full truth of the story. Some say it was exaggerated by the enemies of the Borgia family. After all, they had many. Others believe it was entirely true, but carefully erased from formal records. Whatever the case, the banquet of chestnuts became a legend, a symbol of everything the church was not supposed to be. But perhaps at the time no one was truly surprised. The Renaissance had blurred the line between the sacred and the profane. Art and vice walked hand in hand, and in the heart of it all, the papacy was no longer just a spiritual office. It was a political throne, surrounded by velvet and whispers. Alexander VI would die 2 years later. Cesare's empire crumbled after his father's death, and the family was finally swept aside. But the memory lingered, because there's something unforgettable about imagining cardinals gambling while chestnuts roll across the Vatican floor. Something deeply strange, and oddly human. History is not always noble. Often it's absurd, and just when you think it can't get any stranger, we move on to a pope who became a pirate, and another who tried to buy the papacy outright, and yet another who was so hated. His body was dragged through the streets after he died. Let's keep going. By now, the stories of papal scandal may seem like overripe fruit, sweet, strange, and slightly spoiled. But we've yet to drift into the wildest waters of all. Let's go further back into the early 15th century, a time when there wasn't just one pope, but 3. Yes, 3 men, all claiming to be the true pope, each with their own cardinals, their own courts, and their own versions of righteousness. This strange period in church history is known as the Western Schism, and it tore Europe's spiritual authority apart. At the heart of this mess was a man named Baldassare Cossa. History would come to know him as Pope John the 23rd. Not the modern one. This was an earlier John, and not even a real pope by many counts. Many scholars today refer to him as an anti-pope, a man who claimed the throne but was never truly accepted. But his story is unforgettable. Baldassare Cossa was born in Naples to a noble family with shady connections. Before entering the church, he reportedly worked as a pirate, sailing the coast, raiding ships, and learning the art of intimidation. Whether this part is myth or fact is still debated. But one thing is certain. He understood power. He rose quickly through church ranks, not by piety, but through political savvy and well-placed bribes. Eventually, in 1410, he was elected pope, or so he claimed. This was during the chaos of the Western Schism, when multiple papal courts operated simultaneously in Rome, Avignon, and Pisa. Imagine being a devout Christian in that time. You write to the Pope for forgiveness, but then realize you don't know which one to write to. John the 23rd ruled from Bologna. He was loud, lavish, and shamelessly political. One chronicler wrote that he sold every church office that could be sold, including bishoprics and cardinal titles, often to the highest bidder. Want to become a bishop? Just bring enough coin. He was also accused of murder, theft, and seduction of over 200 nuns. Though it's difficult to verify, the accusations alone paint a vivid picture. And still, he kept his throne for 5 years, until the church had enough. In 1414, the Council of Constance was convened, one of the largest church councils in history. Its goal? To end the papal chaos once and for all. All 3 popes were summoned. 2 resigned. John the 23rd tried to escape in disguise, dressed as a merchant. He was captured, put on trial, and officially deposed in 1415. Among the charges, simony, immorality, heresy, and the classic medieval accusation, being unfit for the dignity of the papacy. He spent years in prison, and when finally released, he didn't return to any throne. Instead, he lived quietly, a man stripped of glory. He died in 1419, a deeply controversial figure. And though he had called himself Pope John the 23rd, the church never recognized the title. That's why centuries later, when Angelo Roncalli became Pope in 1958, he too chose the name John the 23rd, intentionally ignoring the pirate Pope, as if to erase him from the line of succession. It worked, officially. But history, of course, remembers everything, and so we sail on from the schism into calmer waters, or at least different storms, because the next pope on our path wasn't a pirate. He was worse. He was hated by so many that when he died, his corpse was dragged through the streets and tossed out like a villain from a tragic play. Hatred, when left to simmer for too long, doesn't end with death. Sometimes it festers, and sometimes it digs. Let's return to the late 13th century and the turbulent rule of Pope Boniface VIII, a name that still rings with bitterness in the corners of certain history books. Because Boniface didn't just rule the church, he ruled like a king, and often acted like a god. Born Benedetto Catani, he came to power in 1294 after persuading his predecessor, Pope Celestine V, to resign. It was a rare move, one that hadn't been seen in centuries. Celestine was a simple, devout man, perhaps too devout. He preferred prayer to politics. And Boniface preferred power. He moved quickly once elected, issued decrees, expanded papal authority, and most notably clashed hard with monarchs, especially King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, though not for his temperament. Their feud was legendary. At the heart of their battle was a single question: who held ultimate power, kings or popes? Boniface naturally believed the answer was obvious: the Pope. He issued a famous papal bull titled Unam Sanctam, declaring that salvation was impossible without submission to the Pope. A bold move, a dangerous one. Philip was not amused. The French king accused Boniface of heresy, corruption, and insanity. He sent agents to kidnap the Pope, which they successfully did in 1303, during what's known as the Outrage of Anagni. Boniface was seized at his summer residence, slapped, mocked, held prisoner for 3 days. Though he was later released by local supporters, the damage had been done. His pride shattered, his health collapsed, and within a month he was dead. But even in death, he found no peace. Philip IV wasn't satisfied with simply outliving Boniface. He wanted to erase him, condemn him, humiliate him. He pressed the next pope, Clement V, who was far more compliant, to posthumously try Boniface for heresy. Though the trial never formally concluded, the tone was clear. Boniface's memory was to be buried under shame, or so they thought. Years later, in an act fueled more by vengeance than justice, a group loyal to Philip, or perhaps just embittered by the legacy, dug up Boniface's body. His tomb was cracked open, his remains pulled from the earth, and in a macabre echo of the cadaver synod we heard earlier, his bones were dragged through the streets of Rome. A parade of spite, a death without dignity, a grim reminder that papal infallibility ends at the grave, or doesn't, because history has a long memory. And while Boniface VIII may have ruled like a tyrant, he also shaped the very boundaries between church and state that would define Europe for centuries. Even tyrants leave footprints. The story doesn't end here, because if one pope could be slapped, another would be exiled, another imprisoned, and still others bought, sold, and bartered. Yes, popes were spiritual leaders, but they were also men in robes, navigating a world of kings, coins, and consequences. And speaking of consequences, let's talk about the time the papacy was moved out of Rome entirely to a quiet little town in southern France, where luxury ruled and scandal followed close behind. By now, you may be wondering, with all these scandals, power grabs, and corpse-related trials, couldn't the papacy use a vacation? Well, it did. A rather long one. Let's drift to the year 1309, a few years after the bruising death of Boniface VIII and the papal embarrassment that followed. The Vatican, under intense pressure from King Philip IV of France, decided to make a move, a literal one. The new pope, Clement V, wasn't even Italian. He was French, and instead of setting up in Rome, he chose to reside in the quiet southern town of Avignon, nestled along the Rhone River. What began as a temporary relocation soon became permanent, and thus began the era known as the Avignon Papacy, or less kindly, the Babylonian captivity of the Church. For nearly 70 years, from 1309 to 1377, 7 successive popes reigned. Not from Rome, but from Avignon. Technically, they were still the popes of the Universal Church, but in reality, they lived under the heavy shadow of the French crown. They built vast palaces, sipped local wine, and held court in comfort. The Avignon Papal Palace, even today, is one of the largest Gothic buildings in Europe. Life in Avignon was good, for the popes at least, but not everyone was pleased. Rome itself fell into decay. Without a resident pope, the Eternal City began to feel more like a museum than a seat of power. Grass grew between marble columns, fountains stopped flowing, and pilgrims stopped coming. Many in Europe accused the Avignon popes of being puppets of the French kings, too comfortable, too distant, and too luxurious. Corruption blossomed in the sunshine. Church offices were sold openly, taxes were collected aggressively, and papal indulgences, those little pieces of parchment that promised forgiveness, became big business. Money poured in. Morality drifted out. One of the most infamous Avignon popes was John the 22nd, not the pirate we met earlier, but a different John, though no less controversial. He lived to nearly 90 years old, hoarded enormous wealth, and got into theological fights with prominent thinkers of the time. At one point he even declared that souls didn't go to heaven immediately after death, which caused a panic. He later changed his mind, as popes sometimes do. Another, Clement VI, was known for his flamboyant spending and famously said, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And enjoy it he did. His court hosted lavish banquets, employed dozens of musicians, artists, chefs, and, according to records, more falcons than cardinals. Back in Rome, the people grew restless. The idea that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, was ruling from France felt deeply wrong. It wasn't just a spiritual concern, it was political, economic, and cultural. And so, after decades of tension, one pope finally made the decision to return. Pope Gregory XI rode back into Rome in 1377, greeted with cautious joy. But the return wasn't peaceful. Shortly after Gregory's death, chaos exploded. Two different popes were elected, one in Rome, one in Avignon. And soon, a third would emerge. The papal schism had returned. 3 popes, 1 church, 0 unity. But that's a tale for later. What matters now is this. For nearly 7 decades, the centre of Christianity operated out of a peaceful French town, far from the tombs of saints, and closer to vineyards than to martyrs. The church had gone on holiday, and history once again took careful notes. But we're not done, because the Avignon popes weren't the only ones to fall into comfort. Back in Rome, a new kind of pope would rise, one not content with vineyards or velvet robes, but with power that stretched beyond faith into art, war, and the very fabric of Renaissance Italy. Let's move forward to the time of papal warriors, when popes raised armies, led battles, and defended their palaces with swords drawn. As the Avignon chapter came to a close and the papacy limped back to Rome, the world outside the church was changing fast. Art blossomed, science stirred, and politics became a game of shifting alliances and sharpened daggers. The Renaissance had arrived, and with it came a new kind of pope. Gone were the days of hermits and philosophers. Now, the men who wore the white robes were builders, fighters, patrons, and rulers. They were the warrior popes. Perhaps the most famous among them was Pope Julius II. Tall, hot-tempered, and utterly unafraid to shout. He ruled from 1503 to 1513, but those 10 years were packed tighter than a Florentine market at festival time. Julius wasn't interested in quiet prayer. He wanted Italy unified, the church respected, and the papacy feared. And so, he did what no one expected a pope to do. He went to war, in full armour, leading troops on horseback, flying banners with the papal keys stitched beside golden lions. It wasn't a metaphor. Julius actually led armies into battle. He launched campaigns against cities like Bologna and Ferrara, reclaiming lands for the papal states. He surrounded himself with generals, diplomats, and engineers. He issued orders like a general and punished like a king. But Julius was more than a fighter. He was also a visionary builder. He commissioned the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most ambitious architectural projects in the world. He hired Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and bullied him until the job was done. Michelangelo famously hated him, but the ceiling was finished. Julius believed the church must look as powerful as it claimed to be. So he built, he fought, and he ruled. But he wasn't the only warrior pope. His predecessor, Pope Sixtus IV, had already started the trend. Sixtus funded military campaigns, built fortresses, and perhaps most controversially, sponsored a conspiracy to assassinate the ruling Medici family in Florence. The plot failed. One Medici brother was stabbed to death in church, the other survived. And Sixtus, he denied involvement, but few believed him. He had sent troops to support the attackers, and when the city revolted, he responded by excommunicating all of Florence, the entire city. Because nothing says forgiveness quite like mass punishment. These were not gentle popes. They wielded power like swords, and in some cases they literally wielded swords. The papacy became deeply entangled in the politics of Italian city-states: Milan, Florence, Venice, Naples, each one a battlefield of intrigue. And the Pope, often at the centre. It was a strange image. A man in holy robes, sitting in a marble palace, while beneath him mercenaries sharpened blades and letters of war were sealed with golden rings. But that was the Renaissance, a time of contradiction, a time when beauty and brutality walked hand in hand, when a chapel ceiling could show the glory of God, while its commissioner plotted sieges over dinner. Still, despite the blood and betrayal, these warrior popes left legacies that shaped both church and Europe. They preserved the independence of the papacy. They built monuments that still stand, and they reminded the world that popes too were men of their time, full of ambition, ego and flaws, and perhaps a little too fond of armour. But the Renaissance was not the end of scandal. Far from it. Because next came the age of reformers and revolution, of protests and printing presses, and of a pope who sold indulgences like tickets to heaven, only to spark the fire that would split the church in two. If the warrior popes had fought with swords, the next would wage war with parchment, ink, and silver coins. As the Renaissance bloomed with beauty and corruption alike, one particular pope would push the church into a financial frenzy, and unintentionally light a fire that would never quite go out. Let's meet Pope Leo X. Born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, he was no stranger to power. The Medici family ruled Florence with money, cunning, and occasional violence. So it's no surprise that when Giovanni became pope in 1513, he brought with him a love for art, luxury, and legacy. Leo X adored grand projects. He continued the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, employed famous artists like Raphael, and threw festivals that dazzled Rome. But art and marble aren't cheap, so to raise money, Leo turned to one of the church's most controversial practices, the sale of indulgences. An indulgence, in theory, was a spiritual gift, remission of punishment for sin, granted by the church, but in practice it had become a transaction. Under Leo's reign, indulgences were offered in exchange for donations. The more you gave, the more sins were forgiven, or at least that's how it was presented. To spread the message, the church sent out preachers, professional indulgence sellers. One of the most notorious was Johann Tetzel in Germany. He roamed from town to town, booming sermons and selling salvation, with slogans like, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." It was catchy, it was effective, it was outrageous. And in a quiet corner of Wittenberg, a monk named Martin Luther had had enough. Luther, a theology professor and Augustinian friar, was disturbed by what he saw as spiritual manipulation. He believed salvation was granted by faith alone, not by payment, not by parchment. So in 1517 he wrote 95 theses, arguments against the sale of indulgences. He posted them on the door of All Saints' Church, and with the help of a relatively new invention, the printing press, his ideas spread like wildfire. Leo X, initially dismissive, underestimated the movement. He called Luther a heretic, demanded retraction, excommunicated him in 1521. But it was too late. The Reformation had begun. What followed was a fracture in the Christian world, the birth of Protestantism, wars of religion, and a centuries-long reshaping of Europe's religious and political map. All from a piece of paper and a coin in a coffer. Pope Leo X didn't live to see the full consequences. He died suddenly in 1521, likely from pneumonia. He was just 45. At his death, the church was deeply in debt, its authority questioned, and its future uncertain. But Leo left behind magnificent buildings, priceless art, and, whether he intended to or not, a world forever changed. The Reformation would go on to challenge every aspect of Catholic life, and future popes would scramble to respond. But some, rather than reform, doubled down. Because if indulgences could be sold, couldn't heaven itself be negotiated? Let's continue. Because the next pope on our path would redefine opulence, turn the papal palace into a showroom of personal glory, and commission works so stunning they still hang in the world's greatest museums. Let's meet the Pope who hired Caravaggio, dined like a king, and treated sainthood like a business deal. As the thunder of Reformation echoed across Europe, the papacy found itself wounded, but still standing. And while some popes sought to rebuild faith through reform, others chose to reassert their grandeur. And no one did it more flamboyantly than Pope Urban VIII. Elected in 1623, Urban ruled for 2 decades, 20 years of ambition, arrogance, and aesthetic brilliance. He believed in 2 things: absolute papal authority and the power of beauty. So naturally he surrounded himself with artists, architects, and poets. He saw Rome not just as a holy city, but as a stage for his legacy. Urban VIII was a patron of the great Gian Lorenzo Bernini, a sculptor, architect, and theatrical genius. Under Urban's watch, Bernini transformed St. Peter's Square, Peter's Basilica, into a Baroque masterpiece. He designed the baldachin, a towering bronze canopy over the papal altar, the Cathedra Petri, and the grand St. Peter's Square, with its iconic colonnades that seemed to embrace the faithful. Urban adored it. He said the arms of the colonnades symbolized the church welcoming the world. But not everyone felt welcomed. Because alongside art, Urban the Eighth pursued power and money. He heavily taxed the people of the Papal States. He started wars with neighbouring regions and funded them by melting down bronze from the Pantheon, one of the most ancient and revered buildings in Rome. That bronze? It was repurposed for cannons and columns alike. Romans, who cherished the Pantheon, mocked him with graffiti that read, "What the barbarians didn't do, Barberini did." Barberini was Urban's family name. He filled the Vatican with his nephews and cousins, appointing them to powerful positions, a classic move called nepotism, a term literally derived from nepote, the Italian word for nephew. Urban the Eighth didn't just practice nepotism, he perfected it. But perhaps more fascinating was his approach to sainthood. Under Urban's rule, canonization became increasingly politicized. To be declared a saint, a person, or more precisely their supporters, often had to pay. Not openly, of course, but through gifts, influence, and favours. If your family had money and connections, your dead relative had a better chance of becoming blessed. Urban canonized more saints than many of his predecessors, but questions lingered. Were these people truly holy, or merely well connected? Still, his papacy wasn't just greed and bronze. Urban was a poet, a lover of classical Latin. He encouraged scholarship and founded colleges. He defended Galileo at first, then later condemned him when the science grew inconvenient. His rule was full of contradiction. He lifted art to heavenly heights, while dragging papal finances to near collapse. He protected the church's image, even as Rome whispered behind his back. And when he died in 1644, the city exhaled. Some mourned a patron of genius, others just wanted the taxes to end. But Urban left a Rome transformed, not in spirit perhaps, but in stone. The sweeping colonnades, the sculptures, the soaring dome, all shadows of his ambition. And in that marble silence, one can still feel his presence. A pope who believed salvation could be framed in gold leaf, a man who commissioned angels, but governed like a king. As we near the end of this journey, one last scandal waits. A pope who ruled not through bronze or armies, but through secrets, the whispering kind. The kind that moved through velvet halls, changing history with every hushed conversation. By now, you've walked through cathedrals and courts, stepped over spilled ink and broken relics, watched popes ride into battle, and others sip wine beside sculptors. But now, we arrive in the shadows. The candles still flicker, but the voices grow softer, because this pope didn't rule by sword or gold or architecture. He ruled through something far more enduring: fear. Let's meet Pope Pius V, elected in 1566. Pius was a Dominican friar before ascending to the throne of St. Peter. Where previous popes surrounded themselves with family and art, Pius surrounded himself with penitence and surveillance. He was pale, austere, and utterly devoted to what he believed was moral purification. No mistresses, no feasts, no marble extravagance. His court was quiet, his eyes always watching. Pius V came to power in the wake of the Reformation, when the church had fractured and bled, and so he decided to tighten its grip. He expanded the reach of the Inquisition, a network of church-appointed investigators who rooted out heresy, dissent, and forbidden thought. Books were burned, people disappeared, whispers became dangerous. He restructured the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of banned books. It included works of philosophy, science, literature. Even early Bibles translated into the vernacular. To control ideas, he controlled the words themselves. Pius also strengthened the Congregation of the Holy Office, the Church's own internal security system. Its members moved through cities in robes of black and bone. Sometimes they asked questions. Sometimes they didn't have to. Rome became quieter under Pius, but not more peaceful. Still, for all his severity, he was seen by many as righteous. He reformed monasteries, insisted on clean living, prayed constantly. To his followers, he was a holy man. To others, a man with a dagger beneath his robe. One of his most infamous acts was excommunicating Queen Elizabeth I of England in 1570. He declared her a heretic and released her subjects from all allegiance to her crown. It was, in effect, a papal blessing for rebellion. The move intensified tensions across Europe, leading to arrests, executions, and decades of cold silence between England and Rome. Pius didn't flinch. When he died in 1572, his funeral was simple. He had requested no marble monument, no gold-encrusted coffin. But ironically, he would become a saint himself, canonized just decades later. Not for art, not for politics, but for purity. He left behind no Sistine Chapel, no family dynasty, only a tighter grip on orthodoxy. And in the vaults of the Vatican, the lists he built remained. Names, books, ideas, all carefully catalogued. Because sometimes power doesn't shout, it whispers and listens. And now, we've reached the end of our journey. 10 popes, 10 chapters of ambition, scandal, war, art and silence. Some ruled with armies, some with indulgences, some with ink, and some with fear. But all of them, in their own strange way, helped shape the world we live in. So now, as the candle burns low, and the marble fades into moonlight, let the weight of centuries settle softly on your breath. You don't need to remember every name, just the feeling that even the most powerful men in history were still only human. Sleep well, and may tomorrow's world be a little quieter than theirs.